They ran guns, burned enemies alive, and murdered their own. In Sons of Anarchy, mercy was weakness, and loyalty was a loaded gun. These are its 10 most feared figures, and the most dangerous of them all was already dead before the story began. Tig Traeger. Start with the man who scared people precisely because you could never predict what he'd do next. Alexander Tig Traeger was the sergeant-at-arms of Samcro, the club's designated muscle, and he was the kind of loyal that curdles into something dangerous. Tig didn't just follow orders. He hurled himself at them, and if the order was to hurt someone, he did it with a disturbing enthusiasm that made even his own brothers glance at each other. To the outside world, and even to some of his own club, Tig had a reputation as genuinely unhinged a man whose appetites and impulses ran to places most people don't like to think about. That reputation wasn't just for show. He operated with a wild, unpredictable energy that meant nobody, including his closest brothers, ever quite knew where his line was, or whether he had one. In a club that relied on discipline and structure to survive, Tig was the variable that could blow up any plan, the loose cannon whose devotion to the president was so total that he'd cross any boundary if he thought it served the man in charge. That's what made him dangerous in a way the crime lords weren't. Those men were predictable because they acted in their own interest. Tig acted on loyalty and instinct don't always aim where you'd expect. What lands Tig on this list isn't a body count to rival the crime lords further up, it's his volatility. Tig was a man held together by loyalty and rage in roughly equal measure, and when those two things collided, innocent people died. Acting on bad information, convinced that a rival gang had tried to kill Clay Morrow, Tig went after the 1-9ers leader, and instead of killing his target, he gunned down the man's girlfriend in a restaurant. That single reckless act didn't just take an innocent life. It killed the daughter of the most dangerous man in Oakland, and it set in motion a chain of horror that would cost SAMCRO, one of its most beloved members. Tig's mistakes had a way of detonating far beyond him. And yet, underneath the chaos, Tig was devoted to the club with a ferocity that made him useful and terrifying at once. He carried out Clay's darkest work without hesitation, including a hit meant for a brother that went catastrophically wrong and killed an innocent woman instead. He was the guy you sent when you needed something ugly done and didn't want to ask questions about how. That combination, a man of genuine loyalty with no reliable breaks, is exactly why the people around him were always a little afraid. Tig would die for you, and he might just get you killed doing it. What makes Tig genuinely unsettling, though, is the way his menace hid behind humor. He was often the comic relief, cracking jokes and playing the fool, and that made it easy to forget he was one of the most physically dangerous men in the club until the switch flipped and the laughter stopped. His loyalty was so total that it overrode his judgment again and again. He followed Clay off a moral cliff for years, doing terrible things because the president told him to, and only later transferred that same blind devotion to Jax. Tig was the embodiment of what the club did to its most faithful soldiers. It took a man capable of love and turned him into a weapon that could go off in any direction. He survived the series, one of the few who did, but he carried the weight of everyone his loyalty had helped destroy. If there's a lesson in Tig, it's that the scariest kind of dangerous man isn't the one who wants to hurt you, it's the one who has handed his conscience to someone else. Tig outsourced his morality to whoever wore the president's patch, and that made him capable of anything, because he never had to weigh right and wrong himself. He just had to obey. For years, that meant carrying out Clay's cruelty. Later, it meant serving Jax with the same unquestioning devotion. He was a good man's worst nightmare and a bad leader's perfect tool, and the tragedy is that somewhere under all of it was someone who genuinely loved his brothers and would have laid down his life for any of them. That love never made him safe, it just aimed him, but for all his menace, Tig was still a soldier, taking orders. The men who gave those orders, and the enemies who received them, operated on a whole different level of fear, starting with an Irishman who sold death by the crate. Let me say one thing, and then I won't bring it up again. I have gathered everything you could possibly imagine about bikers and hidden secrets into this book. Available at my website, theinvestigator.com. If you want it, it is there. That is all. Jimmy O'Phelan. Some villains threaten your business. Jimmy O'Phelan came after your face, your family, and your soul. Jimmy was a rogue leader within the true IRA, a charming, silver-tongued monster who could smile at you across a table while planning to carve you open. And for a long stretch of Sons of Anarchy, he was the single most personal threat the club ever faced. Where most villains announced their menace, Jimmy hid his behind warmth. He was likable, funny, disarming, the kind of man who made you want to trust him, right up until the knife was already in. That was his real weapon, not brute force, but the ability to make people drop their guard. He wormed his way into confidences, brokered alliances he never intended to honor, and betrayed people who thought he was their friend, all with a grin. In a world where most enemies come at you head-on, Jimmy was the one who came at you sideways, from an angle you never saw, having spent months making you believe he was on your side. Fear of Jimmy wasn't the fear of a gun in your face. It was the worse, colder fear of never quite knowing who around you was really working for him. Jimmy's fear factor was built on cruelty with a signature. Long before the events of the show, he had betrayed and mutilated one of Samcro's own, carving up the face of a man who had trusted him, leaving scars that told the story every single day. He was the kind of enemy who didn't just want to defeat you, he wanted to leave a mark on you that you'd carry forever. And he escalated relentlessly, threatening families, manipulating alliances, and playing every side against the others with the ease of a man who genuinely enjoyed the game. Jimmy O treated human beings as pieces on a board, and he was very, very good at moving them. What made him so dangerous was that combination of charm and viciousness. He could talk his way into a room and butcher his way out of it. He terrorized the club across international lines, tangled them up with the IRA and with law enforcement at the same time, and for a while it seemed like nobody could lay a finger on him. But Jimmy had made the mistake of wounding men who never forget a debt. When the club finally cornered him, the vengeance was intimate and total, a settling of a scar-deep score that had been years in the making. Jimmy O'Phelan learned the hard way that in this world, the men you humiliate will wait a lifetime to watch you bleed. The reason Jimmy climbs higher than the arms dealer before him is that his cruelty was never just business, it was personal, and it targeted the things men love most. He had inserted himself into the family of one of Samcro's most loyal members, taking the man's wife and daughter under his control and using them as leverage, turning a brother's love for his own family into a weapon pointed back at him. That's a special kind of evil, not just threatening a man's life, but poisoning everything that makes his life worth living. Jimmy understood that fear isn't really about death, it's about taking away the people and the dignity a person can't live without, and dangling them just out of reach. For years he did exactly that, and he seemed to enjoy every second of it. His downfall came only when the club was willing to make deals with the devil himself to get their hands on him, proof that some grudges burn hotter than the fear of any consequence. That's the measure of the fear Jimmy inspired. To destroy him, Samcro had to bargain with law enforcement, with rival powers, with people they'd normally never touch, accepting terrible costs just for the chance to put him in the ground. No ordinary enemy warrants that kind of desperation. Jimmy did, because he had proven he would never stop, never soften, never leave their families alone as long as he drew breath. He was a wound that wouldn't close on its own, and when the reckoning finally came, it was delivered by the very man whose face he had scarred years before, a moment of vengeance, so long delayed and so deeply earned that it felt less like a killing than the closing of a book that should have been shut long ago. Still, Jimmy operated on the outside. The next man built his empire from inside, a place most people never leave alive. Ron Tully. Prison is supposed to be where dangerous men are contained. Ron Tully was proof that some men only get more powerful behind bars. Tully was the shot caller for the Aryan Brotherhood, the white supremacist prison gang whose reach extended far beyond any single cell block, and he ruled his world with a quiet, intelligent menace that was scarier than any amount of shouting. He didn't need to raise his voice. He could end your life with a word passed down a hallway. That kind of power is different from anything the street villains wielded, and arguably more absolute. A crime lord on the outside can be outgunned, outmaneuvered, or simply avoided. But almost every dangerous man in this world ends up behind bars eventually, and once they do, they enter Tully's kingdom, a place where he decides who is protected, who is isolated, and who does not survive the week. That gave him leverage over people who feared nothing in the free world, because sooner or later they would need him. He traded in that leverage like a currency, forcing outlaws and gangsters to owe him favors that reached back out into the streets, extending his influence far beyond the walls that supposedly contained him. Ron Tully understood a simple, chilling truth: control the prisons, and eventually you control everyone, because eventually everyone comes to you. What made Tully so feared was the sheer scale of what he controlled. Inside the prison system, his organization was everywhere, and a man in Tully's position could order a killing in a facility hundreds of miles away as easily as ordering a meal. When Sam Crow needed to survive incarceration, and when they needed muscle and distribution that reached into places the club couldn't touch, they had to deal with Tully, and dealing with Tully meant accepting that you were bargaining with a man who could have you murdered the moment you stopped being useful. He was cultured, calm, and utterly lethal, the kind of villain who quotes philosophy while arranging an execution. And Tully proved his reach in the most painful way possible. When one of Sam Crow's own needed to die inside the walls, a broken, guilt-ridden member who had run out of road, it was Tully's organization that carried it out, quietly and efficiently, exactly as arranged. That was the thing about Ron Tully. His power didn't come from a motorcycle or a gun in his own hand. It came from a network so deep and so disciplined that his will became reality no matter where you were. He was feared because he was everywhere and nowhere at once. What made Tully especially chilling was the contrast between his manner and his cruelty. He carried himself like an intellectual, soft-spoken, thoughtful, almost gentle in conversation, the kind of man who could discuss books and ideas one moment and green-light a throat, cutting the next, without any change in his tone. That serenity is what real, secure power looks like, and it was far more frightening than the posturing of lesser men. He didn't need to prove anything, because everyone in the system already knew exactly what he could do. When Sam Crow had to operate inside the prison walls, Tully held their lives in his hand, and he made sure they never forgot it, extracting favors and forcing alliances that reached back out into the free world. He was a spider at the center of a web that covered an entire prison system, and pulling any thread meant answering to him. His reach was terrifying precisely because it had no edges. The clearest proof of that reach came when a fallen member of Sam Crow, a man drowning in guilt over betrayals he could never take back, needed to face the consequences of his choices behind bars. It was Tully's world that delivered the ending, calmly and without fuss, exactly where and when it was meant to happen. There was no dramatic confrontation, no chase, no struggle, just a quiet word, and a life concluded, because that is how absolute power operates when it no longer needs to prove itself. Tully didn't rage or threaten. He simply arranged, and the arrangement became reality. In a show full of men who solved problems with their fists and their guns, Ron Tully was frightening precisely because he never had to lift a finger. His network did the lifting for him, everywhere, all the time. But even Tully's empire was confined to concrete and razor wire. The next man ruled an entire city in the open: August Marks. When the most terrifying crime lord in Oakland finally fell, most people assumed the fear would die with him. Instead, it simply changed hands, and August Marks turned out to be every bit as dangerous as the man he replaced, maybe more, because he was colder. Marks began as the right hand and enforcer to Oakland's kingpin, the disciplined muscle behind the throne, and when that throne came open, he stepped into it without missing a beat and became the most influential gangster in the city. The smoothness of that transition is exactly what made him so dangerous. Most criminal empires fracture when the boss falls, lieutenants turn on each other, rivals move in, and the whole structure collapses into chaos. Marks didn't allow a single crack to show. He absorbed his predecessor's power seamlessly, keeping the machine running as if nothing had happened, which told everyone watching that this was a man who had been ready, who had been thinking 3 moves ahead the entire time. He had learned at the feet of the most feared man in the city, absorbed every lesson, and then applied them with an even steadier hand. He rarely raised his voice, rarely made threats, and rarely needed to because his reputation did the work for him. People simply understood that crossing August Marks was a fatal mistake, and that understanding kept them in line far more effectively than any show of force. Marks was frightening in a very specific way. He was reasonable, right up until the instant he wasn't. He conducted himself like a businessman, spoke in measured tones, and preferred deals to violence, which lulled people into forgetting what he was capable of. He could sit across from you, shake your hand, and discuss terms like a legitimate executive, and then, the moment you crossed him, he would erase you and everyone standing near you without a trace of emotion. That control, that ability to switch from partner to executioner in a heartbeat, made him more unsettling than any screaming maniac. He proved it in one of the most shocking moments of the entire series. After a deal with Sam Crow went sideways and Marks felt betrayed, he took his revenge on one of the club's most beloved. After a deal with Sam Crow went sideways and Marks felt betrayed, he took his revenge on one of the club's most beloved veterans, a warm, gentle, decent man torturing him and then putting a bullet in his head as a message. It was calculated, merciless, and personal, and it announced that August Marks would burn down anyone who wronged him, no matter how sympathetic. He was the polished face of absolute ruthlessness. There's a reason Marks ranks above the men below him, despite arriving late in the story. He represented a modern, evolved kind of danger, the criminal who understands that the future belongs to those who look legitimate. He wore tailored suits, courted respectable business partners, and worked to launder both his money and his image, all while remaining perfectly willing to order a massacre. That made him harder to fight than any street gang, because you couldn't just outshoot him. He had lawyers, politicians, and a public face. He inherited an empire built on fear and ran it with an even colder hand than the man before him, expanding his grip on the city while barely raising his voice. When his war with Sam Crow finally came to a head, it took everything the club's most dangerous man had to bring him down. Marks was the proof that the scariest villains aren't the ones who look like monsters, they're the ones who look like businessmen. And when his war with the club reached its end, it became a duel between the coldest mind in the city and the most dangerous man the Suns ever produced. Marks moved with his usual calm calculation, leveraging money and influence to try to crush Sam Crow from the shadows, and for a stretch, it seemed his patience would carry the day. But he had made the one mistake no one in this world survived. He had murdered a man Jax Teller loved. Marks had spent a lifetime as the most feared person in every room he entered, and he never saw that he had finally met someone worse until it was far too late to matter. But Marks, for all his ice, could still be beaten by a smarter, angrier man. The next figure on this list didn't need an empire to make people afraid. He just needed a job to do. Happy Loman. Most of the men on this list are feared because of what they controlled: territory, weapons, armies of soldiers. Happy Loman was feared for something much simpler and much darker. He was the man who did the killing, and he did it without conscience, without hesitation, and by all appearances, without losing a single minute of sleep. Happy was Sam Crow's most reliable executioner, the brother you called when someone simply needed to disappear. The genius of Happy as a character is how little the show ever needed to explain him. Other villains got backstories, motivations, tragic wounds that shaped them into monsters. Happy just was. He required no justification for what he did, which somehow made him scarier than the men who did. A killer with a reason can be reasoned with, bargained with, understood. A killer who simply doesn't mind, who treats ending a life as neither pleasure nor burden, just work, offers nothing to grab onto. His loyalty ran entirely to the club and to a short list of people he cared about, and everyone outside that circle was simply a potential assignment. When Happy showed up, it usually meant the decision had already been made, the debate was over, and all that remained was the execution. He was the period at the end of the club's most dangerous sentences. And, unlike the crime lords who feared prison, exposure, or betrayal, Happy seemed to fear nothing at all, which removed the last lever anyone might use against him. You can't threaten a man who doesn't dread consequences, can't bargain with one who wants nothing, can't intimidate one who feels no fear. That emptiness made him free in the most dangerous way imaginable, free to walk into any situation and do the unthinkable without a moment's hesitation. Where other feared figures ruled through the terror they projected, Happy ruled through the simple, verified certainty that he would actually do it, every time, no matter who was watching or what it cost. He was living proof that in this world, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun or an army. It was a man who had stopped caring whether he lived or died, or whether you did. What set Happy apart was the total absence of the things that slow other men down. He felt no visible guilt, no reluctance, no moral struggle. Killing, for Happy, was a task to be completed competently, like any other, and he approached it with a chilling, almost cheerful professionalism. There's a piece of Happy's mythology that captures him perfectly: the idea that he marked his own body with a small tattoo for every life he took, a growing ledger of death inked into his skin. Whether you read that as pride or as ritual, it tells you everything. This was a man who kept score, and the score only ever climbed. And that made Happy invaluable and terrifying in equal measure. In a club full of men who agonized over the violence their lives demanded, Happy was the one who never flinched, which meant he was always the one sent to do the things nobody else could stomach. His loyalty to Sam Crow was absolute, and his willingness to kill for it was bottomless, and the combination made him a weapon more than a man. You did not want Happy Lohman assigned to your name. He was the quiet promise of death that hung over every enemy the club ever made. Quick pause before we reach the top of the list, because the final four are the ones that truly defined this world. If you're enjoying this breakdown, the subscribe button is how the next deep dive reaches you. Now, what makes Happy so unnerving in the end is how ordinary he seemed between kills. He wasn't a snarling psychopath or a scheming mastermind. He was a quiet, almost pleasant man who happened to have switched off the part of himself that most people rely on to stop them from hurting others. That's a rarer and more frightening thing than rage, because rage burns out, but Happy's calm never did. He could visit his sick mother and murder a stranger in the same afternoon and feel roughly the same about both. In a story full of men wrestling with their consciences, Happy had simply set his down and walked away from it, and that made him the purest killer the club ever had. But even Happy answered to others. The next figure gave the orders, and she never rode a motorcycle in her life. Gemma Teller, the most feared person in the world of Sons of Anarchy for most of its run, never fired a gun in a shootout or led a charge into enemy territory. She ruled from the kitchen, the bedroom, and the shadows, and she was more dangerous than any of them. Gemma Teller Morrow was the matriarch of Sam Crow, the widow of a founder, the wife of a president, and the mother of a future king, and she used every ounce of that position to control everyone and everything around her. To call Gemma a villain almost undersells her, because she didn't see herself as one for a single second. In her own mind, everything she did, every lie, every betrayal, every death she caused, was in service of protecting her family and the club she loved. That self-justification is what made her so relentless and so dangerous. A person who knows they're doing wrong might hesitate. Gemma never did, because she had convinced herself that the ends always justified the means, that a mother's love excused any atrocity committed in its name. She could weep genuine tears over a loss she herself had caused. She could comfort a person she was actively destroying. She wielded her role as matriarch, the beating heart of the club, the woman everyone turned to as a shield that kept anyone from suspecting how much blood was on her hands. For years, it worked perfectly. Gemma's power was manipulation, and she was a master of it. She could plant a lie, turn brothers against each other, and steer the entire club toward a decision while making everyone believe it was their own idea. Many fans have argued that Gemma, not any of the flashy villains, was the true antagonist of the whole series, the one constant presence whose scheming caused more death and destruction than any outside enemy. She had helped orchestrate the death of her own first husband to clear the path to power years before the show even began, and she spent the following years protecting that secret with a ruthlessness that never wavered. That original crime is the hidden engine of the entire series. Gemma and Clay conspired to remove the club's founder, Gemma's own husband, and Jax's father because he had grown disillusioned with the violence and wanted to change the club's direction. In killing him, Gemma didn't just murder a man, she murdered a future, steering Sam Crow down the bloody road it would travel for the rest of the show. And she did it while raising the dead man's son, looking Jax in the eye year after year, shaping him into the heir of a throne she had helped steal. Everything that made Jax who he became, every death, every war, every tragedy, flowed downstream from that single act of betrayal. Gemma carried that knowledge her entire life and never broke under it, which tells you she was capable of a kind of sustained, cold-blooded deception almost no one else in the story could match. And then Gemma did the thing that sealed her place near the very top of this list. Convinced, wrongly, that her son's wife had betrayed the club to the police, Gemma cornered the woman in her own kitchen and killed her brutally, personally, with a household object, in one of the most shocking murders the series ever aired. It was an act of paranoia and possessiveness, so monstrous that it detonated the entire back half of the show. Gemma killed the person her son loved most, and then she lied to his face about it. She was feared because she was everywhere. She saw everything, and she would sacrifice anyone, even family, to keep her grip on the world she'd built. What elevates Gemma above nearly every gun-toting villain in the series is that her weapon was other people. She rarely needed to get her own hands dirty because she could engineer outcomes by whispering the right lie to the right man at the right moment. She understood the club's men better than they understood themselves, their egos, their fears, their loyalties, and she played them like instruments, steering wars, breaking up relationships, and ending lives, all while maintaining the image of a grieving mother and devoted wife. The scariest thing about Gemma is that for most of the series, no one even realized how much of the bloodshed traced back to her. She was the invisible hand behind the throne, and she was ruthless enough to have helped murder her own first husband to put the men she chose in power. After the murder in the kitchen, though, her luck finally ran out because she had wronged the one person capable of doing to her what she had done to so many others. Her crime would summon the two most dangerous men left standing. The first of them had been the king all along. Damon Pope. Every villain in Sons of Anarchy made the club nervous. Only one made them genuinely, visibly afraid, the kind of afraid where hardened outlaws lowered their voices and admitted they were out of their depth. Damon Pope was the most powerful and most dangerous gangster in Oakland, a crime lord who had built a legitimate business empire on top of a criminal one, and he moved through the world with the terrifying calm of a man who had never lost anything he wasn't willing to lose. From his very first appearance, Pope announced himself as something the show had never seen before. His introduction involved displaying what he had done to a man who had wronged him, a demonstration so grotesque and so deliberate that it needed no words to communicate the message. "This is what happens to people who cross me, and I will make sure everyone sees it." That was the essence of Pope. He didn't just punish his enemies, he turned their suffering into theater, into a lesson for everyone else. And he did it all while maintaining the unbothered serenity of a man conducting routine business. The other villains in the series wanted things: money, power, revenge, and their wanting made them vulnerable. Pope seemed to want nothing he didn't already have, and a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain is the most dangerous kind there is. Pope's fear factor was almost mythic. He was patient, brilliant, and absolutely without mercy. And when Sam Crow accidentally killed his daughter, he didn't explode, he planned. What followed was one of the most horrifying campaigns of revenge in the entire series. Pope's opening move was to burn one of his enemy's daughters alive, right in front of her own father, a moment so brutal it told everyone watching that this was a man with no flaw, no line he wouldn't cross, and that was only the beginning. He seized control of the club's earnings, orchestrated the imprisonment of its members, and then forced them into an impossible choice: hand over one of their own to die or all suffer. That choice cost the club one of its most beloved men, who chose to sacrifice himself in a prison fight to save his brothers, a death engineered entirely by Pope's reach and cruelty. Damon Pope demonstrated something no other villain had, that he could make Sam Crow dance. He could reach into their world and take whatever and whomever he wanted, and there was nothing they could do to stop him by force. He was untouchable, and he knew it. In the end, it took cunning rather than strength to destroy him, a betrayal and a bullet delivered by a man Pope had tormented. But the fear he generated outlived him, because he proved the club could be broken. What set Pope apart from every other antagonist was his patience and his vision. Lesser villains wanted money or territory or revenge in the moment. Pope thought in years and moves ahead, and he had built something almost no criminal ever achieves: genuine legitimacy. He funded community programs, cultivated politicians, and presented himself to the public as a philanthropist and pillar of Oakland, all while running its underworld with an iron grip. That duality made him nearly impossible to fight, because attacking Pope meant attacking a beloved public figure with the law, the media, and the city on his side. He was the rare villain who had made himself part of the system rather than an enemy of it. And beneath that respectable surface sat a man who could order a child burned alive in front of her father and then calmly return to his business. That gap between the polished exterior and the bottomless cruelty underneath is what made Damon Pope the most frightening presence the show ever produced. The moment that cemented his legend was the impossible choice he forced on the club. Having jailed several of the sons, Pope decreed that one of them had to die inside for the others to walk free. That kind of psychological cruelty was Pope's signature. He didn't just kill people, he made them complicit in their own destruction, forcing them to carry the guilt of decisions he engineered. When one of the most loved men in the club stepped forward to die in that prison so his brothers could live, beaten down in a staged fight, it was a sacrifice made necessary entirely by Pope's reach. He had turned the club's own loyalty and love into the instrument of their grief. No villain before or after made Samcro feel so utterly powerless, so completely at the mercy of another man's will. Pope didn't just defeat them, he humiliated them, and he made them thank him for the privilege of surviving it. Only 2 men on this entire list were more feared than Damon Pope, and the club had been living with the first one for years. Clay Morrow. For most of Sons of Anarchy, the greatest threat to the club didn't come from Oakland, or Ireland, or a prison yard. It sat at the head of the table, wearing the president's rings. Clay Morrow ruled Samcro with an iron fist for years, and he was feared not as an outside enemy but as something worse, a tyrant king who would murder anyone, including his own brothers and his own family, to hold on to power and protect his secrets. The most chilling thing about Clay is that his throne was built on a foundation of betrayal that almost no one knew about. He had risen to the top of the club not through honest leadership but through murder, eliminating the man who founded it and stood in his way, then spending the rest of his life killing to keep that secret buried. Every act of leadership he performed, every speech about loyalty and brotherhood, was delivered by a man who had violated the club's deepest principles to get where he stood. That hypocrisy is what makes him so dangerous, because it meant there was no line he wouldn't cross. He had already done the unforgivable, so everything after was just maintenance. Brothers who got too close to the truth died. Family members who threatened his grip were beaten or eliminated. Clay had made a bargain with his own soul long ago, and he spent the series making everyone around him pay the interest on it. And the interest was staggering. When a founding member and old friend discovered what Clay had done and threatened to expose him, Clay killed the man himself, silencing a brother of decades to protect his lie. When he wrongly suspected another member of disloyalty, he ordered that man's execution, an order that went wrong, and left the member's wife dead instead. An innocent woman gunned down because of Clay's paranoia. He threw an Allied Club's veteran off a roof for defiance. He raised his hand against his own wife when she dared to question him. Each of these acts was committed by a man who then stood before the club and spoke of loyalty and family with a straight face. That gap between the words and the blood is the truest measure of how dangerous Clay Morrow really was. Clay's list of crimes is staggering precisely because so many of them were committed against the people who trusted him most. He was behind the death of the club's original founder, clearing his own path to the throne and to the founder's wife. When a first-generation member of an Allied chapter crossed him, Clay personally threw the man off a rooftop. He ordered a hit on a brother he wrongly believed had turned informant, a hit that went wrong and killed that brother's innocent wife instead. When an old friend and founding member learned too much about his secrets, Clay murdered him in cold blood, and when his own wife spoke against him, he beat her savagely. This was a man who treated loyalty as a one-way street that ran only toward himself. What made Clay so terrifying was that his violence wore the mask of leadership. He committed monstrous acts and framed them as protecting the club, protecting the business, protecting the brotherhood, when in truth, he was almost always protecting Clay. He was the rot at the center of Samcro, a Shakespearean villain who had killed a king to become one and would kill again and again to stay one. His reign of fear only ended when the rightful heir finally turned on him, delivering the death Clay had spent the entire series earning. The genius of Clay as a villain is that Sons of Anarchy is, at its core, a retelling of Hamlet, and Clay is the murderous uncle who kills the father, seizes the crown, and marries the widow. Every terrible thing that happens across 7 seasons can be traced back, in some way, to the original sin of Clay having the club's founder killed to steal his throne and his wife. That means Clay wasn't just a dangerous man, he was the poison in the well, the lie the entire world was built on top of. For years, he ruled through a mixture of genuine leadership and pure intimidation, and the men around him followed because they respected him, feared him, or both. Even at his lowest, stripped of power and facing his enemies, he remained defiant and dangerous to the very end, the kind of man who would bite a piece off a prison guard rather than show weakness. He was feared because he had gotten away with everything for so long that he believed himself untouchable. He was wrong about exactly one person. Because there was one man Clay had underestimated for years, the Golden Son, who had watched and learned and was about to become the deadliest man this world would ever see in the flesh. Jax Teller. He started as the hero, he ended as the deadliest man the club ever produced. Jax Teller was the vice president and then the president of Samcro, the golden-haired heir who spent the early seasons dreaming of dragging the club towards something cleaner, something better than the bloodshed his stepfather thrived on. It's worth remembering how genuinely good Jax seemed at the start, because it's the whole point. He was the one member who questioned the killing, who wanted the club to get out of guns, who carried his dead father's writings around like a roadmap to a better life. Fans loved him because he was the conscience of a violent world, the man who might finally break the cycle. That's exactly what makes his story the most disturbing on this list. Not that a monster stayed a monster, but that a good man became the worst one of all. And by the end, Jax Teller had more blood on his hands than any villain he ever faced, because he became the very thing he set out to destroy, and then he surpassed it. Look at the sheer scope of who Jax personally sent to the grave, and the ranking makes itself. The most feared men in this entire world, the untouchable Oakland Emperor, the tyrant king of his own club, the ice-cold kingpin who inherited a city, the international arms dealer, the corrupt power brokers Jax, killed or destroyed nearly all of them. Every figure ahead of whom he now stands was, at some point, a mountain the club couldn't imagine climbing, and Jax climbed each one and left a body at the summit. He didn't do it in a blind rage either. He did it with planning, patience, and a strategic mind that would have made any of those villains proud, orchestrating betrayals and executions with the cold precision of a chess master clearing the board. The idealist who once wanted to lead the club out of the darkness had, by the end, outdarkened every villain the darkness ever produced. He wasn't just another dangerous man in this world. He was the last one standing because he had personally removed everyone else. The transformation is the whole tragedy of the series, and it's why Jax stands so near the very top of this list. One by one, the most feared figures in his world fell to him. He engineered the assassination of the untouchable Damon Pope, the man who had broken the club, turning Pope's own cruelty back on him. He shot his stepfather Clay Morrow in the throat and chest, ending the tyrant's reign with his own hands. He hunted down and killed the crime lord August Marks. He pulled the trigger on the Irish arms dealer Galen O'Shea and the corrupt operator Charles Borowski. He avenged his wife by taking down everyone connected to her death. And in the most devastating act of all, when he learned the truth about who had murdered the woman he loved, Jax executed his own mother committing matricide with a look on his face that told you a part of him died in that moment too. That is what makes Jax the deadliest figure of them all. He didn't just kill villains, he became more lethal, more strategic, and more remorseless than every single one of them, a one-man reckoning who systematically dismantled every threat in his path. The sweet, idealistic young man who wanted out had become a reaper in a leather cut, and by the end, there was no enemy left standing, because he had killed them all. Jax understood, finally, that he was too far gone to ever be the man he'd dreamed of being, so he settled every debt, said his goodbyes, and rode to a death of his own choosing, arms spread wide, at peace with the monster he'd become. The reaper on the back of his cut had stopped being a symbol. It had become the truth of who he was. The horror of Jax isn't that he was born evil, it's that he was born good, and the world of Sons of Anarchy ground that goodness down, choice by choice, corpse by corpse, until nothing was left but the killer. He started the series reading his dead father's manuscript, dreaming of a version of the club that didn't run on blood, genuinely wanting to lead the Sons towards something legitimate. And every time he tried, the life pulled him back and demanded another body, and Jax paid the price every time, telling himself each murder was the last one, the necessary one, the one that would finally set things right. It never was. By the final season, he had out-schemed the schemers, out-killed the killers, and out-feared the men who had once terrified him, a transformation so complete that his own mother became just one more name on his list. He is the deadliest figure in this entire world, not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because he was the proof of what this world does to everyone in it. The hero and the monster turned out to be the same man, and that is the most frightening idea the show ever offered. His final act completed the tragedy. Having cleared the board of every enemy and settled every score, Jax understood there was no place in the world for the man he had become, and no way back to the man he had been. So he made one last plan, this time for his own end. He tied up the club's future, ensured the people he loved would be protected, confessed the weight of everything he'd done, and then rode out to meet death on the open road with his arms outstretched, echoing his father before him. It was the choice of a man who had run out of enemies to kill and finally turned the reckoning on himself. In the end, the deadliest man in the world of Sons of Anarchy delivered his own execution because he had become something even he could no longer live with. That is the full arc of the Golden Sun, from the boy who dreamed of peace to the reaper who dealt out death to everyone, including, at last, himself. But even the reaper was made by someone else's hand. Every drop of blood Jax ever spilled, every villain he buried, every mile of his descent, traced back to a single man. He barely remembered the father, who was murdered before the story even began, whose ghost dictated every choice his son ever made. Jax was the deadliest figure this world produced, but he was not the most feared. That title belongs to the one man who ruled the entire saga without ever appearing in it alive. John Teller, the most feared figure in the entire world of Sons of Anarchy, never appeared in a single scene alive. He was dead before the series even began, and he was still the most dangerous man in it. John Thomas Teller, JT, was the founder and first president of the Sons of Anarchy, the man who created the entire world. Every other name on this list lived and died inside. And the fear he inspired wasn't the fear of a gun or a knife. It was something far rarer and far more powerful, the fear of an idea. JT was a Vietnam veteran who came home in the late 1960s to a country he no longer recognized, and he built the club as a refuge, a brotherhood for men like him, founded on a genuine philosophy of freedom and defiance, its very name borrowed from the anarchist thinkers he admired. He wanted the Sons of Anarchy to mean something. But over the years, the club he'd dreamed up drifted into gun running, drugs, and blood, and JT watched his own creation curdle into exactly the kind of violent machine he had never intended it to be. And unlike every other man on this list, he wanted to tear it back down. To understand the man, you have to understand where the club came from. JT didn't dream up the Sons of Anarchy on a whim in a bar or a garage. He'd carried the idea since he was a boy, and the name itself was borrowed from the great anarchist thinkers he'd read, figures like Emma Goldman, whose vision of individual freedom standing against a corrupt system became the club's founding creed. When he came home from Vietnam alongside his closest friend, Piney Winston, the two of them and a handful of other veterans, the men who would become known as the First Nine, built the club as the living embodiment of that idea, a free brotherhood, answerable to no government, no corporation, and no authority but itself. For a while, it actually was that. But the thing that finally broke JT wasn't only the gun running, it was grief. He began writing his manuscript in the wake of the death of his younger son, Thomas, a little boy lost to the same congenital heart defect the Teller bloodline had always carried. Buried in that loss, watching the club he'd founded on principles of freedom curdle into a machine for moving weapons, JT poured everything he had left into that book, and he dedicated it to his two sons, to the one already at peace, and to the one he prayed would never know this life of chaos. He was a man mourning a child and a dream at the very same time. And somewhere inside that grief, he made the decision that would get him killed. Not out of ambition, not out of greed, but out of a desperate, doomed hope that he could still save the one son he had left. That desire made him the most dangerous man in Charming. Because JT didn't just grumble about what the club had become, he wrote it all down, pouring his disillusionment and his vision into a manuscript titled The Life and Death of Sam Crow: How the Sons of Anarchy Lost Their Way, a document that laid bare everything the club had become and everything it had betrayed. And he made a decision that terrified the men who profited from the bloodshed. He was going to pull the Sons out of the gun trade and drag them back towards something legitimate. To a man like Clay Morrow, who wanted guns and money and power, JT's vision wasn't idealism, it was an existential threat. The founder was going to dismantle the empire before it was ever finished being built. So they killed him. In 1993, JT's motorcycle was struck by a semi-truck, and he was dragged down the road, dying 2 days later from his injuries, and for years it looked like a tragic accident. It wasn't. Clay Morrow had his bike sabotaged, and Gemma, JT's own wife, knew the truth and said nothing. The most feared figure in the entire series was murdered by his best friend and his wife, not because he was violent, but because he wanted the violence to stop, and peace was bad for business. That single act, the killing of the founder to steal his club and his widow, is the original sin from which every other horror in the show flows. It is a story lifted straight out of Hamlet, and JT is the murdered king whose death poisons the entire kingdom. And here is why he sits above every killer, kingpin, and tyrant on this list. Death didn't diminish John Teller's power, it multiplied it. His ghost hung over every season of the show. His manuscript, when his son finally found it, detonated the whole series, turning that son against the very men who had raised him. Clay and Gemma spent 2 decades terrified of that book and the truth it held, because it could destroy them, and eventually, it did. Every major character was shaped, haunted, or doomed by a man who had been in the ground for 20 years. His words reached out from beyond the grave and tore apart the empire that had been built on his corpse. Look at what his shadow did to his own son. Jack spent the entire series chasing his father's vision, trying to become the man JT had wanted to be, and failing in exactly the way JT had feared he would. The founder had dedicated his manuscript to a single desperate hope that his sons would never know in this life of chaos. And the deepest tragedy of the whole show is that Jax knew nothing but chaos, and died the exact same way his father did, riding into an oncoming truck with his arms spread wide. The founder's fear for his son came true, down to the last detail. That is a kind of power no crime lord on this list ever came close to holding. The power to write the ending of the story before it had even begun. So, who was truly the most feared figure in the world of Sons of Anarchy? Not the enforcer, not the kingpin, not the tyrant king, not even the reaper his son became. It was the quiet, idealistic founder who simply wanted the killing to stop a man so dangerous to the machine of violence that they had to murder him to silence him, and then spent the rest of their lives losing to his ghost anyway. John Teller proved the most frightening truth the show ever told. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill what he believed. And sometimes the dead hold more power than the living. Every other name on this list feared a bullet. Only one of them could rule an entire world from beyond the grave. And that is the strange, haunting truth sitting at the very center of this whole story. Every other man who ever wore the Reaper on his back fought to hold on to something: territory, money, respect, a seat at the head of the table. They clawed and killed to keep what they had, and the second they lost their grip on it, the world moved on and forgot them. But John Teller never had to hold on to anything, because he had already planted it. He put his idea into the ground the way a man plants a seed, and no matter how many people tried to bury it deeper, it kept pushing back up through the cracks. You cannot shoot an idea. You cannot run it off the road with a truck. You cannot pay it to look the other way. And that is exactly what made JT untouchable in a way no living man on this list ever was. Think about what that fear actually looked like. Clay Morrow spent 20 years sitting at the head of that table, holding the gavel, believing he had won. He had the club, he had the money, he had JT's wife, he had JT's chair. He had everything the founder built with his own 2 hands. And yet every single day of those 20 years, he lived scared, not of a rival club, not of the cartel, not of the cops, but of a dead man's handwriting, a book, a stack of pages sitting in a box somewhere, patient, waiting. That is what real fear looks like. Clay could stare down any gun in Charming without blinking, but the thought of that manuscript coming to light kept him up at night, because he knew that the moment the truth got out, everything he had stolen would turn to ash in his hands, and in the end, that is exactly what happened. That is the part people miss about JT. He didn't win by being the strongest man in the room, he won by being the only honest one. He looked at the thing he had created, and he loved it enough to tell the truth about it, even knowing that truth would cost him his life. Every other name on this list lied to their brothers, to their families, to themselves, to protect what they had. JT did the opposite. He wrote it all down, plain and simple, and he signed his name to it. And it was that honesty, not any weapon, that reached out across 20 years and finally pulled the whole rotten empire down on top of the men who killed him. So when you ask who was really the most feared figure in the world of Sons of Anarchy, don't look at the biggest gun or the highest body count. Look at the man who never fired a shot on screen, who was already in the ground before the first episode began, and who still managed to decide how the whole thing would end. He wrote the last page of the story before anyone else had even read the first. His son chased his shadow, wore his ring, sat in his chair, and died the very same way he did, riding straight into an oncoming truck with his arms thrown wide, just the way his father had gone. The founder's greatest fear came true down to the smallest detail, and it came true because JT had seen it coming all along. That is the power no kingpin, no enforcer, no tyrant could ever touch. They ruled with fear while they were breathing, and the moment they stopped, their power died with them. John Teller ruled from the grave. He built the world, he named it, he warned it, and then he watched from the dark as every single person in it lived out the ending he had already written. You can kill a man. You can bury him, lie about how he died, and steal everything he ever loved. But you cannot kill what he believed, and if what he believed is true enough, it will outlive you, outlast you, and one day it will come knocking. Every other name on this list feared dying. John Teller taught them all a far more terrifying lesson, that some men only truly begin to rule once they're already dead.